Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and today I have a guest interview for you. Today's guest is Dr. Dan Plews. Dr. Plews is actually a return guest. He was on, it may have even been a few years ago at this point, it was at least a couple of years ago. And we talked about just his understanding and take on low carbohydrate endurance. So I wanted to have Dr. Plews back on to chat about some of the updates that we've seen over the years, or the things he's learned or seen that differ or add to what we talked about in that other episode. And even maybe a little more specifically, it was a bit timely in the sense that there was a study that just released. I did a episode on, it was episode 341, called New Study Questions Low Carbohydrate Performance Deficit. So I wanted to hear what he thought about that, if he saw any limitations or anything really new and earth-shattering about it. Obviously, I did an episode on it, so I gave my take on some things where I thought maybe there were some limitations, or what we would see if we would actually stretch it out longer versus what questions maybe it did answer, which I think is just a good way to maybe look at any one study, because ultimately these studies can only address a certain number of questions. And a lot of times they're going to have to leave other questions off the table, or in a lot of cases, actually generate new questions. So you don't always walk away feeling like you gained the end all be all answer to anything with some of this stuff, but interesting nonetheless. So if you're interested, check out that episode. I talked to Dr. Dan about that as well as a bunch of other things. So for those of you who want to know a little bit about Dan's background, Dr. Dan Plews is an applied sports scientist. He has a PhD in exercise physiology. He's a researcher and endurance coach. He has competed at a high level in triathlon, including an age group record at Kona. He has worked with numerous world and Olympic class athletes in the sports of rowing, kayak, and triathlon. He employs a low carbohydrate approach to his own training and racing and with some of his coaching clients. Dr. Plews is actually just coming off a win at a half Ironman recently. So I got a little bit of a download on kind of how things were going in his life with training and racing, as well as, like what I said, his view on the landscape of fueling in some of these longer endurance type sports. Before we get rolling with Dr. Plews, just a few announcements. Also coming up on the guest interview front, I actually have a recorded already. It's up on the show Patreon page, is an interview with Amy Berger. So Amy Berger has a fun YouTube channel that I like called Keto Without the Crazy. So Amy's actually also a return guest. She was one of the early guests. I think she was in the early enough where it was before the 100th episode. So I wanted to have her back on, find out what she's been up to, and also talk about some of the stuff that she's been doing on her YouTube page, because I mean, just the low carb ketogenic diet in general, there's just a lot of stuff out there now. So I think people sometimes get a little paralyzed with, what do I need to do? Do I need to be checking blood ketones? Do I need to be doing this? Do I need to be doing that? Do I need to be minimizing this? Do I need to be maximizing that? And at the end of the day, it kind of gets maybe a little complicated for those who have even been doing it for a while in terms of whether they feel like they're doing it right. Amy Berger tends to kind of try to eliminate a lot of the high tech extra stuff and trying to go back to the foundations and just say, like, here's some simple tasks to kind of take away and get started. Let's master these and then move on from there if you want to. And I think that sort of a more simplified approach can be very useful for people who get a little paralyzed with the amount of stuff that's actually out there. So if you want to check that one out early and support the show, you can do that by checking out the show Patreon page, which includes episodes early released and ad-free. So you can find details to that at zachbitter.com/HPO. Links to that are also in the show notes. Also over on that landing page is zachbitter.com/HPO are all the episodes, catalog of all the previous episodes. So if you want to scroll through and see what topics and guests that I've had on previously and check out some of those, that's a good spot to check it out. It's also got all the details and things there too. So it's kind of the one-stop shop for the show Patreon page, show catalog, and some other support options if you're interested in supporting the Human Performance Outliers podcast. If you want to help support the show through other means outside of Patreon and monetary support type stuff, what goes a long ways is subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform. So if you listen to the podcast on a specific platform, clicking subscribe so that the podcast gets updated to you whenever I release a new one. That goes a long way. Also, if you like an episode, sharing it on social media, sharing it with your friends and family, that helps me grow the show as well and bring in new, interesting listeners. Also, if interested, I've been recording some solo episodes that I'm going to continue doing on endurance training. The first one was actually titled Endurance Training Simplified. It was episode 344. And what I did with that one is I tried to just take the concept of the different training intensities that I find to be the most important ones to really get comfortable with and really understand the intensities or the perceived effort within those very, very well, and break those down into 5 categories. You could actually make an argument that there are 4, depending on the race distance and intensity that you're doing. And I just looked at each one of them and kind of broke them down and tried to share some information about how to maybe better learn them or better apply them in a way that will allow you to really get good at that before getting overly creative with your workout structure and things like that. So after recording that one, I got a lot of good feedback from the listeners. So I thought, hey, maybe I'll take each one of those categories, or at least some of them, and break them down in their own individual episodes so we can go a little bit deeper into each one of those intensities that I covered in that one. So I started out with short intervals for the more recent one and titled it Short Interval Simplified. I'm going to do another one probably next. Will probably long interval simplified. Then I will do like base intensity simplified and easy run simplified. I don't think I'm going to do a long run simplified, even though I could, partly because the long run tends to fall into some of the other intensities to a degree. And I actually just did a long run episode not that long ago called episode 377, the long run, considering the variables. So I feel like I touched on that enough with that one. But ultimately what I think I might do is when I get them all finally recorded is I'll package them all up into a newsletter and send that out to anyone interested about just like to have that kind of list of those episodes. Or if you want, you can easily just dig through the catalog and find those. So head over to zachbitter.com/HPO if you want to see the ones that have been released, and stay tuned for the next rounds of them. Also, let me know if you have other topics similar to that you'd like me to touch on. I'm always interested in hearing what the listeners are wanting to know or find interesting coming from me. So feel free to reach out to me at zachbitter.com or through one of my social media channels at zachbitter on Instagram, at zbitter on Twitter, at zbitterendurance on Facebook. One more quick announcement. If you're looking for coaching support, you can head to my website, zachbitter.com. I've got options there from ready-made plans that follow my philosophy. Lots of options with that one, from 5K all the way up through 100 miles. I even got a base builder program, a strength athletes endurance program, and multiple levels for each of them. So whether you're just getting started or you've been doing this for a while, I've got options for you from a variety of distances and a variety of different starting points. So you could do that. You can also sign up for consultations if you want to chat with me one-on-one about a specific topic or question you might have, as well as one-on-one personalized coaching if you want to step it up above some of those pre-made plans and work with me directly. There's options there as well. All right, folks, let's get rolling. Dr. Dan Plews, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Good to be back, and yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I was looking at kind of the timeline of things. I know we were going to record a little bit earlier, and then we had to reschedule. And then, as fate would have it, a low carbohydrate performance study kind of came out. So I'm kind of glad now that I didn't have to ring you back up and be like, "Hey, Dan, can you come back on in short notice and talk about this one too?"
it was clearly fate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's probably a fun topic to maybe jump into. And for listeners who are interested, I did have an episode with Dan a while back, and I'll put in the intro when that was and ways to find it, so that if you want to kind of get a background on everything that Dan's up to and his background and stuff like that, you can do a double dip and check out that episode as well. But the study I'm referring to is actually the more recent one that was titled Low and High Carbohydrate Isocaloric Diets on Performance, Fat Oxidation, Glucose, and Cardiometabolic Health in Middle-Aged Males, where I thought it was really interesting because it sort of looked at just like if we send these guys out for what they used as a 1 mile time trial and then a 6x800 session, are we going to notice a performance dip if they're sticking to what was essentially a pretty strict ketogenic diet? I think they were like right around 50 grams of carbohydrate, give or take a few grams. So lower than what I would have what I would do personally, being on a low carbohydrate diet. So I was really interested to kind of see kind of what all played out there. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts kind of going into it. Just what was did you have any anticipation of what they would maybe find? And then did anything kind of surprise you at the results of it all?
Well, not really, because I mean, I don't know if you know, we published a paper that was I think it was also in Frontiers. Well, we looked at a very low carbohydrate diet for a period of 12 weeks, so it was quite a long one. It was similarly less than 50 grams.
Mm-hmm.
And what we looked at was basically the ability to perform high intensity interval training. So it was intervals on the bike, but it was all at 110% of VO2 max. So slightly different when we didn't really measure fat oxidation during, but what we did find there was no difference between the groups. So low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate, the low carbohydrate group did not have their ability to do the high intensity intervals diminished at all. So, it's kind of a similar thing in this study, 6-800. So 800 is probably quite close to 3 minutes as well for most people, 2.5 to 3 minutes, I'm guessing. And they found similar things in that there was no difference between the groups. And there was no real reduction. So I think it's not really surprising. But some of the main outcomes that I found particularly interesting was the levels of fat oxidation that were recorded in the study. Like up to 1.8 grams per minute during such exercise, which is exceptionally high and way higher than we're used to seeing. And what's interesting, and funnily enough, as I was saying to Zach, you were saying to you just before we started the podcast, is that there's actually a follow-up it's more of an opinion piece that's just been published as well, also in Frontiers, that was basically it talked about this study where Tim Noakes was the lead author, and I was actually one of the reviewers on that paper as well. So I was really fortunate enough to read it before it came out and kind of give my opinions and add a little bit to it. But what was key in that is 1.8 grams per minute, and that's measured doing indirect calorimetry. So that's using the oxygen, basically putting the mask on and testing it, which would typically actually underestimate levels of fat oxidation, because we can't really measure fat oxidation at more than 85% of VO2 max because once we get up to a high intensity, we start producing lactate, and then we have to buffer that lactate by lowering so the pH gets lower, we buffer the lactate via carbonate or bicarbonate, and therefore we buffer it with VCO2. And because of that, the VCO2 portion goes up really, really high. And that means that we generally underestimate the fat oxidation. We're not really able to measure it, actually. So although we can question how accurate the measurement is at that intensity, you can only question that it might be higher, not lower. So I think that's super, super interesting. And I've always been one to say, like, it always seems funny to me, if you measure people in the lab and you increase the intensity, eventually you'll see people with a minus percentage of fat metabolism, right? It'll go into the minus numbers, which of course is impossible. You can't have a
You're
minus
gaining
number.
fat while you're working out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the errors come in. So you're having these minus percentages of fat metabolism. But this idea that I've always struggled with, the idea that fat metabolism basically goes to zero at high intensities, because I think mechanistically it makes absolutely no sense for it to go to zero when you can still obviously use it to produce some ATP. I don't know why, maybe not a lot of those higher intensities, but I think it's still making a much higher contribution than we realize. And just to finish off, there's a professor out here in New Zealand called Dave Rowlands, and he's been working on some like isotope tracer data that's trying to look at the true level of fat oxidation during high intensity exercise, which is proving to be quite difficult because of the bicarbonate pool and the way that changes during high intensity exercise. but some of his early data is very suggestive that fat metabolism, even at 95, 100% of VO2 max, is much higher than what we believe it to be, and what certainly industry pushes us to believe, because then obviously we can think that all we need is carbohydrates, which I don't believe is the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would seem like if there was any room to still have a contributor of any sort, regardless of fat or otherwise, it would be like, it would make sense that your body would try to maintain that. It wouldn't necessarily try to like just go completely to zero unless of course you're, I guess, mainlining enough carbohydrate where you sort of have, or you're following a really high carbohydrate and following what we're kind of seeing some people kind of test the limits to, which is like a gut training type of situation. Whereas then maybe in that situation, your body gives up on a certain substrate in order to.
Perhaps. But I think what's important to realize is that as most athletes and coaches and nutritionists understand, this idea that carbohydrate fat usage at a high intensity is zero, right? It goes to zero, but it's not used at all. I'm not saying that isn't the case, but we certainly don't know it is the case. And sure. I think that's an important differentiation, and I don't think we can accept that it is true, because we just do not have the ability to measure it accurately as of yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like one of the more interesting data points of that study too, along the lines of fat oxidation rates, was to like, when you look at the literature that they would produce earlier from just fat oxidation rates essentially moving to zero, it was at like 85% of VO2 max, where with this particular study, I think, I can't remember what the exact numbers were, but I mean, it was increasing.
It was 95.
Yeah. So it was well past what would you normally be. Just not only was the crossover point pushed further back, but when you get up well past like aerobic threshold and up into, like I mentioned, like 85% VO2 max, we're still seeing relatively high fat oxidation rates at that point. And the other thing that was kind of interesting too, I think, was just the level of some of the fat oxidation rates from some of the participants, where I think one participant, it was a 10-person study. So like you got it's always fun to dig into the individuals within it to kind of see like where did they get these averages from in terms of like the spread amongst the population that they tested. And there was someone who was like above 2 grams per minute. And I was just thinking like, just, the level of fat oxidation at that point, I guess I wasn't overly surprised to see that, given that like when I was a participant of the FASTER study it was back in 2014 at this point. It doesn't seem like it was almost 10 years ago, but it was. And
wow, God, 10 years. That's amazing.
I know it's amazing how long ago that was at this point, but I think I was right around like just under 1.6 for my peak fat ox, which was right around the average of the group that they had from the high fat group. And I wasn't as low carbohydrate like in the weeks, months leading into that study as these guys were, sitting at around 50 grams. Granted, I was training a lot more than them as well, because I think their training threshold was actually quite low compared to what I was doing. So who knows how that normalizes with the lifestyle variance. But still, like I would imagine if I would go down to kind of a more strict gram ceiling of 50 or something like that, my fat oxidation rates would go up quite a bit, even be above and beyond what I saw during that particular study.
Yeah, it's obviously like exercise training is one of the main drivers of fat oxidation, right? It's funny you mentioned it. I had a question the other day. I was on another podcast where I'm training a professional triathlete, and with him, I'm definitely using more of a right fuel, right time approach, where we're trying to restrict carbohydrates, and then of course age groupers then come ask me, they say, "Oh, does that mean I don't?" Because lots of age groupers, they don't really want to. If they want to improve the fat oxidation, the last thing they want to do is stop eating their bread, right? So they think it's an excuse to not have to do like a ketogenic phase. But I have to explain that you're not a professional, you're not training 30 hours a week, so you've got to push the lever in other ways, right? And with you're obviously training so much, so I don't think that you would have to be, you've got two pillars, you've got two like levers to pull. You've got your training on one side and the diet on the other. If you really pull on the training lever, you don't have to pull very much on the diet lever. If you really don't do much of the training, you've got to pull quite hard on the diet lever. And I think that's a really important differentiation and an important way to think about things.
hmm Yeah, no, that is a really good point because you can easily go down this kind of view of just like, well, improving fat oxidation rates is done one way, when in reality, like you said, there's multiple levers. Some are going to be bigger ones in terms of how much of a difference it makes, from what I can tell. But really, like you have things like your training, like you could have someone just following a typical moderate high carbohydrate diet, and if they add training to the context, their fat oxidation rates are going to improve to some degree. If they reposition the carbohydrates they're eating, say further away from their workout, they may improve their fat oxidation rates. And I think I was talking to Dr. Mike Nelson, who's been on the show a few times, and he sent a study to me. This is maybe almost a year ago at this point, and it was kind of like, I don't know that it necessarily was conclusive in any way, but they suggested that even just the type of carbohydrate could play some role in your fat
Yeah.
oxidation rates. So like a simple
Yeah,
carbohydrate.
I would say that has to be true, right? Because the
hmm
different types of carbohydrates will have direct implications on your insulin production.
hmm
So more sugary refined is going to increase your insulin, going to blunt your fat metabolism a little bit more, whereas something that's probably a little bit more starchy or a bit more, a bit more wholesome would not have the same implications. Like I would expect. It's an interesting one. Like like if you look at the data, the train low, like so I've done the train low kind of training, right fuel, right time, and I've had like the number of cases that basically I've never had it not work. It
hmm
works all the time, like, and people will always improve their fat oxidation if they just restrict carbohydrates the night before, and in the morning they do their training in a somewhat depleted state. They will definitely increase, their fat oxidation definitely increases. But if you look at the research, it's yet to show that that has long-term implications. It definitely shows that during that training session, your fat oxidation is improved, but whether that works chronically over time, like so when you go back to a normal diet, it's also improved, is a bit unequivocal, really. But I just think that that it's not being done properly. It's not being done long enough. People haven't been training hard enough for them to see the true effects. Because now we're talking multiple double digits of athletes who I've seen just not by doing a low carbohydrate approach, just by doing the right fuel, right time approach, actually seen some big changes in their levels of fat oxidation.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. I think we're seeing that more and more, like in now that, especially now that we have more athletes that are actually kind of going through the full process of it and doing it for a long enough period of time too, where we actually have some longevity to the approaches that individuals are
Yeah.
doing too. And I know I had Leighton Phillips on not too long ago to kind of just talk about just his perspective with all of it and what he's seen. And like Matt Kerr was obviously one of the examples that he had who, I mean,
Yeah,
it's just a
yeah. I think Matt Kerr though he I don't know whether he's a good example because he was very low. He was actually following a very low carb diet, as well.
Mhm.
So he basically did the exact same procedure as we did in LDT 101. Is he did a ketogenic phase, 3 to 4 weeks, then he went on to a low carb diet. So I think that has more legs. But what I'm saying is that I think there's also athletes who don't even go low carb at all. It's just all petitioning carbohydrates around training. That
Oh.
also seems to have a very effective. It also seems to be quite effective.
Mhm. Okay, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, the other thing with the study that I kind of thought was really interesting was just the application of what this maybe means to the average runner versus what we typically see with studies like this, where it tends to be, oh, we tested, some high performing athletes and we got this data versus what does this actually mean? We look at, I mean, the I'm going to say it again, like the train your gut approach is like, okay, we see professional athletes doing this, people who are like doubling or tripling the resting metabolic rate on some of their like big sessions and race days sometimes. And it's like, yeah, I can see a path forward where like their workload is so high that they have like an opportunity to say taking carbohydrate on a 60-minute easy run and everything else that comes with it versus your average person, they start doing that. And it's like they're going to take a rather large chunk out of their daily energy requirement simply by training their gut. And then you have to ask, like, what are the ramifications outside of that? And I think maybe this study highlighted that to some degree, where 3 out of the 10 participants on the moderate to high carbohydrate diet actually were producing um uh their blood glucose scores, their fasting blood glucose scores were in the pre-diabetic range. And it wasn't like they came in like that. In fact, those same individuals, when they reversed and went on the low carbohydrate, or in this case ketogenic diet, they were actually the highest fat oxidation rate folks as well, and their fasting blood glucose dropped down well below the crossover point from normal to pre-diabetic into, I think, even to the 80s in most cases.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts kind of on that side of the study? And I guess, was it surprising?
Yeah. Well, I think to me that was the best part of the study, because I think, as people reading that study, and anyone who runs, anyone who does triathlon, anyone who does these events, they're inevitably doing it because they want to be leading a healthier life, right? And I think general sports nutrition guidelines do not, they think through one lens, is that it's performance, performance, performance. And we know that on one side now that it probably carbohydrates aren't necessary to really enhance your performance. It's been shown in this study. And there's even a meta-analysis that was produced that looks at the difference between low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate studies. And that's not me saying it. This is a meta-analysis that said there's literally, it's hard to say there is a difference between low and high carbohydrate diets when it comes to endurance performance. But I think to the point I'm trying to make is that in the end of the day, you run because you want to be healthier. So you have to think of it in that holistic manner. And for many people, in fact, in this study, 30% of them, 30% of the population in this study needed to have a low carbohydrate diet. Otherwise, they were going to have some kind of metabolic dysfunction, right? So they're doing running to be healthy. They're following the dietary guidelines of a high carbohydrate diet because they're running. They're actually making themselves worse or less healthy and not more healthy. And I think that's something that definitely has to be considered when people are thinking about the right diet for them. I think it's more than just performance. And Phil Maffetone and Paul Wilson, they published a great paper that was called "Athletes Fit but Unhealthy." And they talk about the whole HPA axis and how if we get it wrong and we don't consider what we're doing in terms of how we're partitioning our high intensity exercise, making sure our low intensity is low enough, making sure we're not having refined sugars and on a lower carbohydrate diet. We can actually get into a bit of disarray. And although we're fit, overall we can actually be quite unhealthy. And I think that is one of the key messages of this paper, is that you're more likely to be on the healthier side if you do limit the carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing about this study that maybe has it stand out from some of the other low carbohydrate studies, regardless of whether it was performance or just health and weight management and things like that of the past, is they actually controlled for things like weight loss, and both groups actually ended up losing a little bit of weight over the stretch of their kind of planned dietary practice, but it was consistent with one another. So it's not like you had when the individuals went low carb, they lost more weight, and then the high carb group gained weight or something like that, where you have kind of that contrast. Which
has been the case in many studies, right? Like lots of the low carb versus high carb studies, the low carb group have typically lost more weight, their power to weight's increased, so their VO2 max per mils per kilogram has increased. But this one was so well controlled in that particular instance that that I think it shows that it was a really great study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was a question that I was curious about, that it sort of did answer as much as it could anyway, was like this idea of like, what are the possible negatives of a moderate high carbohydrate diet with an endurance training program with like that blood sugar control standpoint when weight is held constant or even depreciating. Because like I could totally see, like, if they gain 2-3 pounds, it's like, yeah, if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates and you're gaining weight on it, you're probably going to have a raise in your blood sugar across. And then you can point the finger at the weight management side of it versus the macronutrient. But I was kind of surprised actually that it was 3 out of 10. I wouldn't have guessed it to be that if I was asked before the study, but it was clear as
There was
day in
another
there.
there was another study that was published that looked at had a similar um I think it was in elite judos or it was martial arts, and they looked at
Mhm.
kind of the metabolic dysfunction in elite athletes, and 30% again elite athletes. So it's not the first study to actually show it. It's probably, I think, the athletes being having some kind of metabolic dysfunction and being a little bit insulin resistant is there's probably a higher prevalence than we realize. And I think all you have to do is look at, if you go to a triathlon, there's loads, so many age groupers who are competing, and you can see that their body composition isn't what you would expect it to be for an athlete who's training 15-20 hours a week.
Mhm.
And I think it's mainly because they do have some form of insulin resistance, and they have been told that a high carbohydrate is what they need. A high carbohydrate diet is what they need to optimize their training and recovery, which which is not the case according to the data here.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting stuff. So I guess like from a takeaway standpoint, what should someone listening to this who's following an endurance training program, questioning whether they're making the right dietary choices? Is this something where it's sort of like, well, if you fit in that 30% that found themselves in a pre-diabetic state, you're likely someone who should be a little more proactive in maybe picking a lower carbohydrate option for yourself versus
Yeah.
those other seven? Or is this something where like even with performance, you're like, this may be sort of a paradigm shift in terms of what people should actually be practicing on average with when it comes to endurance sport?
Yeah, I think like if all things are equal and your blood sugar you're on a high carbohydrate diet, you enjoy eating that way, all your metabolic markers are in within the right range, you've got normal blood sugar, then you can't really say that a lower carbohydrate is better. But I think if you are someone who just presents certain things, like maybe you bonk very easily when you go out for a run, you really find it hard to lose weight. You have measured your blood glucose in the morning and it's above 5 in a fasted state. If you have some, you can even measure your HB1C. I'm not a massive fan of with athletes, but you can measure all these things, and if you are that way and you're training, then it's definitely something that you could consider, because you can be rest assured that your performance will not deteriorate. If anything, it will probably just get better.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this episode's sponsors are my friends at LMNT Electrolytes. They have a wide range of electrolyte supplements and are currently offering listeners of this podcast a free sample pack with purchase. If you are interested in checking them out and letting them know that you came to them through here, you can go to drinklmnt.com/HPO or to the show sponsor landing page, which is just zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Links to that are in the show notes as well. Do you think that if this type of protocol was used with let's step away from the population that they use for this test and move into like a more professional athlete setting, is this any indication that professional athletes should be questioning a moderate to high carbohydrate diet as like the standard and be thinking about reducing their carbohydrates or even becoming a ketogenic diet at this point in time? Or is this just too many limitations with a study like this to really push the needle anywhere more to that
Yeah,
direction?
I think you can. I think it's definitely, you can ask some questions. I think it shows that it's definitely not necessary. I think with athletes, like as we talked about at the start, with different levers to pull, it's probably because they're training so much, it's not as important. And there's always the risk here. I think with professional athletes who are training a lot, the moment you start restricting macros, you restrict overall calorie input, and that can be a bit of a problem, because lots of them struggle to eat enough generally. And if you say, okay, I'm not going to eat any carbohydrates now, then suddenly they just find themselves short on calories, and then obviously there's problems like REDs and relative energy deficiency that can be associated with that. So I think that's something to be aware of. But I do think that if you want to use a lower carbohydrate diet for a period of time to push the needle in certain areas of your physiology, you might want to improve your body composition, you might want to improve your fat metabolism, whatever it might be. You don't have to worry about your performance being deteriorating or something like that happening, right? So I think you can I think it just shows you that you can have it as a tool in your toolbox and use it as and when you want to use it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find then too, because I mean, and you're working with athletes that are putting in like a larger training volume than most of the runners out there just due to the lower impact of the swimming and biking side of things. Is there a number that you're a little more comfortable, or I should ask if you actually even target a specific gram number? My experience has been like when I'm really putting in a lot of volume, if I go by like a gram per day protocol, like you're going to see in a lot of ketogenic protocols, it simply just doesn't account for the acceleration of metabolism. So like what would be 50 grams for me sitting around doing nothing might be 150 grams if I'm putting in like one of my bigger workouts of a training block. Is that any consideration place, or do you place any consideration on that when you're working with athletes that are skewing lower carb?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not actually, for athletes, I'm not a fan of like ketogenic diets because I just think it's too the carbohydrate's too low, and I don't really believe that we're as humans designed to be in ketosis continuously. We should be in more of a cyclical ketosis, and as athletes we would typically do that. You'd wake up in the morning, you might have a coffee, go for a run, and exercise induced ketosis. You would be in ketosis by the end of your run, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So the typical number that I put is anywhere between 100 and 100. I find 130 is quite a good sweet spot. So around 130 to 160 grams per day. I mean, that's typically where I sit, and the athletes who I coach who follow a lower carb diet also sit around that area. But the pros who I coach who aren't really interested in the low carbohydrate diet, and I think that's an important differentiation. You have to have good buy-in from the athlete, right? Otherwise, there's no point persuading them or making them do it. And then I decide if their fat oxidation is a limiting factor of success. And don't forget, we're talking about Ironman triathlon, so fat oxidation is important.
Sure.
It's not a 10-kilometer race walk where it's not really an important factor. Then I would use more of a right fuel, right time approach to address their fat oxidation. So limiting reducing glycogen before exercise and limiting carbohydrates during. So,
and that makes sense. I mean, we're talking about professional athletes at the triathlon distance. It's like they're going to have access to that stuff. Like they're going to have their fat oxidation rate. So you're going to be able to see pretty conclusively whether it's going to be problematic for them in terms of what energy demands they're going to have at race intensity, and then what their fueling strategy is going to be required in order to make that work.
Exactly. So I just started coaching two high level professionals. Like they're both very good, like super top end. And I started coaching them very close to one another. I had them both in the lab, and I look at all areas. I don't just look at fat metabolism. I look at all areas of the physiology. But between the two of them, one had terrible fat metabolism. The bite threshold wasn't that strong, and the running economy was quite poor. So they're the kind of the three things that jumped out. Whereas the other one had an exceptional fat metabolism, but the other two, like this same athlete, anaerobic threshold cycling was quite low, and the running economy was quite poor. So I use similar approaches for the threshold and the running economy in terms of to try and boost that up in the program. But with one, I just left the fat oxidation alone because this guy wasn't even doing a low carbohydrate diet or anything, and he was still like 1.3, 1.4 grams per minute in his highest. So I'm like, well, why I don't need to do anything about that, and this was cycling. So it's just about knowing what you need to do at the right time and understanding what's important for performance.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think kind of like transitions into another kind of topic or question I wanted to kind of address with you, which is just like, there's going to be the scenarios that we saw like in this particular study we just talked about, or your typical training session, where I think the evidence is mounting that like the real need to be doing like a bunch of carbohydrate loading before a training session it's not going to impact that training session in a meaningful way. So like if you feel better waking up in the morning, having a cup of coffee, heading out and doing your workout, you don't have to worry like, oh, my short intervals are going to be compromised. Now, maybe if that creates a big, like you mentioned before, a big calorie deficit that you don't make up at the end of the day, and that becomes a repeated problem, you're going to find other issues come up on a performance front down the road. But assuming that that's not the issue, or that's not an issue, what do you suspect, like especially with these individuals from the study, let's say they're going to do like a marathon or something like that, or maybe let's normalize it to like what you would see in kind of professional sports, and they'll do a race where the intensity is around 2 hours. Do you suspect for them, they're gonna want to bring carbohydrates back for that, right?
I
During the
would
race
suggest,
anyway.
I mean, I think, and this is one of the reasons I'm against the being ketogenic, particularly around racing, because if you want to quote unquote be ketogenic, you have to be in ketosis.
Mm-hmm.
And to be in ketosis and to produce ketones, your liver has to be depleted of glycogen. And one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is they think fatigue, glycogen, it's due to glycogen depletion in the muscle. So the reason that we're taking carbohydrates during exercise is to diminish the level of glycogen depletion in a muscular level. And that's actually not the case. So if we're taking carbohydrates, the level of depletion in the muscle is actually the same. There's no difference. But what we are doing is we are helping the depletion of liver glycogen. And the liver is often, I think, is underrated at how important it is for endurance exercise, because that is probably, it is the thing that is stabilizing your blood glucose. So it's preventing like hyperglycemia, and hyperglycemia is the thing that causes fatigue in most cases. So if you're starting your exercise or your running race with a depleted liver glycogen, you're definitely going to fatigue earlier, because you're already going to be somewhat hyperglycemic before you even start, or you very shortly will be after you start. So you want to start, what's important is that you start with a high levels of liver glycogen fully topped up, and then if you want to take carbohydrates during as well, that's totally fine. But of course, you will deplete your liver glycogen even when you sleep. So when you sleep, you have brain activity, you take it from your liver. So I like to think that you should still have carbohydrates even when you wake up, in a long way from your racing, so you don't so you're not kind of getting an insulin, you're at the other side of the insulin spike before you start racing, and then start your race. Generally, athletes on a lower carbohydrate diet, they don't have to take in too much carbohydrate to get stocked up on their muscle glycogen, because they're generally just burning less carbohydrates in their day-to-day anyway. So if you think about a high carb athlete who takes in 60 grams of carbs, they're probably going to burn 50 grams of that and then store 10, whereas a low carbohydrate athlete would pretty much store 100% of it and keep on burning fat just in their day-to-day. So that is it. So I find that just nipping yourself up to around 200 grams a day, 2.5 days, 3 days before racing is generally enough to get a bit more in the tank, and then make sure you're fully topped up on the start line.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what do we know about just the interplay of like what you were talking about once the race gets started? Because I know, when we're sitting here, if we both decided to, take in, say, 50 grams of carbohydrate now, our bodies would release insulin, and that would essentially encourage the reduction of fat metabolism in favor of that exogenous carbohydrate source. But once you're into the event itself, there's going to be an interplay where your body, like we were kind of talking about earlier, isn't going to want to necessarily shut down or limit fat oxidation to a large degree. Is there a sweet spot in an event where, regardless of what your diet is, you can start a little more liberally taking in carbohydrates so that you kind of have a double-edged sword, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, we actually published a meta-analysis in Sports Med on this, and we looked at basically all the things that impact fat metabolism. So we looked at habitual diet, we looked at levels of muscle glycogen, we looked at taking carbohydrates during exercise, intensity, duration, all these implications. And of course, one of the things that we found was that really much the sweet spot was about after an hour of exercise, you can take in what you want, and it's not really going to do that much to your fat metabolism.
Mm-hmm. When you're working with athletes at the individual level, are you personalizing how much they're taking in per hour then, or is there a little more of a standard that tends to work for individuals of a similar diet pattern?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, yeah, there is variations. I think when you're dealing with like amateurs and age groupers, the fat metabolism, I have to look at what the fat metabolism is, because if it's quite low, I mean, okay, let me start again with this actually. So, it's a combination between how much power they're producing, right? So if you're producing a lot of power, that's a lot of calories, right? So more power requires more calories. So that could be in the form of carbohydrates and fats, right? But overall, it's just generally more. And then the other side is the fat metabolism. So in some pros, you can have a situation where their fat metabolism is actually really good, but their calorie requirement is also really high.
Mm.
So despite their fat metabolism being really good, they're also burning a shit ton of carbs at the same time. So in that particular instance, you might still have to be considering 60 to 90, up to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, even though they have a good fat metabolism, purely because they're big guys, they're producing a lot of power, and calories per hour is really, really high. So that's kind of the way I would look at it. And then conversely, you could have on the other side, you might have a lower end athlete, amateur, who has a very poor fat metabolism, but they're also producing 100 watts, right? So very little power, very little calories. So even though their fat metabolism is poor, they still might not actually need that many grams of carbohydrates, so that's the kind of the way I look at it. But I find that most amateurs, I tend to put them between 50 and 60 grams per hour, work on the fat metabolism before 50 to 60 grams per hour, which I know is quite safe. It avoids them having to have fructose as well, which I think is problematic for a lot of athletes. And yeah, I tend to find that works pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And are you coming up with the grams per hour based on their fat oxidation tests when you have that data, or?
Yeah, I mean loosely. Yeah, I mean I'm not. I mean it's not that
It's
I'm
not quite
not.
that exact.
It's not quite exactly. So I use it as a guide, right? I use it as a bit of a guide to kind of, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just I'd love to say that do an exact calculation and like say, oh, well, it has to be this many grams of carbs actually 52.5 grams per carbs, but it's just the testing's not that exact, right? So it's hard to know, but I just kind of use it as a rough guide, yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, ultimately, like, if we had all the answers going into the race, it wouldn't be all that much fun because there'd be nothing to find out. And to some degree, I think it's like, yeah, you get the data you can, and then you have essentially a ballpark target, and then you have to kind of stress test it and find out. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. And I think like 60 grams, 50 to 60 grams is a nice number because you can limit it. You don't have to take fructose, which we know like 30% of the population are not very tolerant of anyway. And it causes a lot of, fructose ingestion during exercise causes a lot of gastrointestinal distress and can potentially also blunt lipolysis and so blunt your fat oxidation. Um, and it's just safe, right? Most people can tolerate that quite easily. And you're at the upper limit of what's tolerable anyway in terms of oxidation rates of a pure like glucose maltodextrin, whatever it might be. So that's how I like to think of it. Yeah, I mean when I've raced in the past, I've always gone between 50 and 60 grams per hour. Yeah, I think you're the same, right? 40 to
yeah,
50.
I might go a little lower depending on the duration, but some of the events I'm doing are going to be up 12 plus hours. So it's like my intensity comes down a little bit. The most formulaic I got with it actually was I had a fat oxidation test done and it suggested that like the intensity I was going to be racing at, which was just under my aerobic threshold, was going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 80 to 90% fat, 10 to 20% carbohydrate. So I just looked at, well, I'm going to be moving roughly 9 miles per hour. That's 800 to 1,000 calories per hour, roughly, is what I'm going to be asking my body to give out energy wise. So, whatever, run the number, so to speak, and kind of get yourself in like the right range. And I knew like 40 grams seemed to be plenty for that calculation. And I knew I could tolerate 40 grams without a digestive issue in most cases. So 40 grams is kind of what I pinned it to that day. I think I was pretty consistent too with that one. I might have like went up to 50 on a couple occasions on near the end of the race, but more or less around 40.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think that's a very intelligent way to go about it, and I think that makes a lot of sense. We published a paper actually that was in Sports Medicine. It was called Different Horses on the Same Courses, where we looked at, like, because there's some like pros publish the data, the power numbers, and we said, okay, if you've got the pro who's producing 310 watts over the course of an Ironman, even if their fat oxidation is at 1.4 grams per minute, sorry, which it wouldn't be actually in that particular situation, they still actually couldn't support themselves without taking in quite a bit of carbohydrate. And I think that's the crux of the matter. But if you've got another athlete who's doing 200 watts, you actually could support yourself with very, very little carbohydrate. So if your fat metabolism, especially if your fat metabolism is high, then you wouldn't need very much.
Yeah. No, I think about this when you start getting into like 24-hour events, or just like the, ultra running's goofy, where we have such different environments where, I mean, a lot of people, their goal is to finish in a day. Like, you're out on a trail, and it's like the reality is 24 hours is a really sound target for them. And it's like the intensity you're moving at when you're going to be out there for 24 hours is very low. So you start getting into that type of duration and intensity, where you can start asking some of the more interesting questions, I think, around whether carbohydrate fueling or how necessary is it in that context.
You just need food, right?
Yeah, I think so. Well, and that was another interesting thing too, because I think like a lot of the research I've seen that looks at just the rate of perceived exertion declining by ingesting carbohydrate. Like, is there tests that they've tried other things other than carbohydrate? Like if I'm out there running and I'm feeling a little bit like the effort is picking up at a given pace because I'm burning a lot of calories or for whatever reason, and I take in like bacon or something like that, is the ingestion of food maybe also lower the rate of perceived?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of receptors and whatnot in the gut, and even I think as food goes through down the throat, right, and into the stomach, I think it detects, and it has some sort of detection that can detect the energy coming in. So I don't know whether there's any research to suggest it, but a lot of that stuff is just receptors in the mouth as well, right? Like perceptions of rate of perceived exertion. They even go down with people just swirling sugar, carbohydrate drinks, and not even drinking it. So there's a bit to be said for that as well, like caffeinated gum and gum with carbohydrate and not actually swallowing it, people still have lower rates of perceived exertion. So like typically when I'm doing an Ironman, when I come into the last like 5K or whatnot, and I'm going for an A station, I'll just literally swirl the Coke. I won't swallow it because nothing's gonna be happening to that in that instance when I'm getting so close to the finish. So I'm like, why do I want to put it into my body? It's just gonna be extra weight for me. So I just literally swirl it and spit it out. And get the benefit from that way.
Yeah, I've actually used hard candies for a similar purpose in races before too, just to kind of have that more constant signal where it's like it's a relatively low amount. I mean, you're looking at like 5 grams of carbohydrate for one of those, but just the relative slow processing of
and the receptors in the mouth. And it's quite fascinating research, that is actually quite cool.
It is.
The other thing I would say is I think the research now where there's a lot looking at ingestion of 120 grams per hour and training the gut, and I think like if you look at the data, one is that the research that shows that even when athletes are ingesting 120 grams an hour, they're typically not oxidizing more than 90 grams, right? So sorry. So they're not really doing more than 90 grams. But what's interesting is I do think perhaps those higher ingestion rates might have their utility in races that are over multiple days, because it might allow you to take in more calories during the days before, which keeps you a little bit more stocked up, because it's not like it's going nowhere. It's got to be going somewhere, I'm assuming. I think I wrote a blog on this that might maybe like in a Tour de France or something like that, those larger ingestion rates might have a say, but I don't think 120 grams is really for people doing single day races. And I also don't think that training the gut is a thing that people really need to consider or worry about. And I reckon that you need to look at both sides of the coin, right? You can you want to train the gut, or do you want to increase your fat oxidation? I would rather increase my fat oxidation and carry less. And even in those studies that look at those gut training studies, they're very, very positive in showing that yes, you can tolerate more. You train the gut, you can tolerate that amount more carbohydrate, but it doesn't necessarily show that they're effective in increasing your levels of oxidation. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be using more of those carbohydrates. You're literally just taking them in. And that's where I think, like Morton Gel, for example, they've done an amazing job at making people take more carbohydrates because you can tolerate more of it,
Yeah.
but it's not doing anything. And so now they have these products where people can have more, so they can sell more, and but it's not actually doing anything really. I mean, the research shows that it doesn't improve oxidation rate. It's been shown time and time again. I think there's one study that might have showed a somewhat positive effect. It does increase your tolerability for sure. Don't deny that. You can take 120 grams and be fine, but it's not doing anything. It's not doing much else than that. So.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if they could do a study where they sort of combined some studies that they've done in the past where like once you get to 90 grams, you cease to actually consume it and kind of do the protocol you described at the end of your race where now they're just like swishing and spitting it out. And see like what changes do they get with the presumed presence of 120 versus the actual presence of 120.
And there's something to be said for that anyway, because generally, as time goes on through exercise, your ability to, because of the stress, and you get more and more stressed through duration, and your ability to ingest and oxidize the carbohydrates becomes worse. So this is why, if you keep on going, it can become more and more difficult. And that's why, like some of my pros, for example, we kind of, we do the swim and then we start the bike, and we'll actually start higher and then kind of come down during the bike a little bit and then just maintain what they can during the run, just basically ad libitum during the run and just take anything you're in your aid stations. But we might start at like 100 and then come down to 90, and by in the last like hour they're at 60. And I think that can be quite effective because then you're up high and then you're coming down to low when you're particularly as you're getting ready to run as well. You don't really want to be starting the run with a full tummy, right, either. So
right. It seems like triathlon is just built perfectly for this protocol because it's like you're not going to probably ingest, or if you are, you're giving yourself a logistical hurdle if you're ingesting something during the swim. So you sort of have this like time frame of abstaining from fuel while you're swimming, and then you hit the bike, which is going to be the most friendly spot to be ingesting high amounts of calories. Get a lot of it in there, and then when you go to the run, which is going to be a little less friendly, but if you like described it the way you did, where you're kind of overloading during the bike stage, you kind of have that forgiveness built in.
I think that's the way I tell my athletes is I think you have to look at it as though the ideal scenario is if you can start the run fully hydrated and fully topped up with carbohydrates, like you haven't, you can. So basically, the bike hasn't done anything. Then you're in the best position to run the best marathon you possibly can, right? So I think and then you can kind of deplete over the course of the marathon. I mean, when I did Kona in 2018, I started the marathon, and during that whole marathon, I just had 2 gels, so 60 grams of carbs during the entire marathon, and I had the 5th fastest marathon in the entire race, including professionals. So clearly, it's clearly, I think it's quite a good way to think about things, especially when it comes to hydration, because if you look at dehydration and the effects of dehydration on performance, it's like you can become gradually dehydrated during exercise, and it doesn't seem to have much effect. To almost 3-4% of your own body weight, and people are still running and doing really well. But what is clear is if you start exercise dehydrated, then you're in a pickle. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh, and that makes sense too, because a lot of this, I think, like I can't think of a study that they've done on dehydration's impact on performance where they actually didn't preempt dehydration. So that would make sense that if they're seeing that big of a drop off after like the 2 to 3% that normally shows up, that if you're starting, like it would be exactly what you just said, you're starting out with that deficit.
It's the starting that's the issue, and this is where the dehydration studies are quite smart. It's easy to prove that dehydration reduces performance. Actually, you just especially if you dehydrate people a little bit before a performance test, then generally they don't go as well. But if you're running during, it's the opposite. Most people, like the people who lose the most weight running, largest percentage, are generally running the quickest. It's an inverse relationship. So
Yeah. Interesting. A bit of a pivot and just a question I want to ask, because I know I'm going to get some questions about this after I get them from anytime this topic gets addressed, is just uh, the pushback from maybe the less expected group, which is kind of the no carbers, where um, I'll inevitably be asked, like, well, why do you take in carbohydrate at all? And we've been talking about this to some degree, but maybe just directly, like, when someone comes to me, they're like, well, gluconeogenesis is going to be enough to take that role if you reduce your carbohydrates down to zero. My response is always like, gluconeogenesis is great, but when you're asking your body to produce an energy output to the level that you're doing in like a marathon, a triathlon, even an ultra marathon, it's just simply not fast enough. So like it's a question of like it's a more of a question of speed as much as it is like application at that point. What are your thoughts about that, or do you have any feedback around that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think we discussed it a little bit already. I think that like one is the relative energy deficiency. I think when you really strictly deprive yourself of a whole macronutrient, you just run out of options a lot of the time. Like, that think about what that means is that you can't have, if you really want to be zero carbohydrates, you couldn't have any carrot, you couldn't have any kind of pumpkin, you couldn't have any of those sorts of like rooty vegetable foods, right? I mean, there's a lot of foods that are added to the list when you can add like 100. There's a big difference between 50 grams and 130 grams in terms of how easy it is to live your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's quite hard to live your life in less than 50 grams per day. It's easy to live your life with 130 to 150, and I think that's an important differentiation, is that it makes life a lot easier for one, and also I also think well then the other point was like I said before, yeah, is that I don't believe you should be in ketosis all the time. And if you actually look at athletes who are permanently on a lower carbohydrate ketogenic diet and they measure their ketones in the morning, eventually they will be out of ketosis in the morning. And then they have this obsession with being in ketosis. And then the only way that you can do it is eating less and less, fasting more, And before you know it, you've got this massive problem with athletes who are chasing ketones.
Chasing the wrong target, yeah.
Chasing the wrong target, and they're in a massive energy deficit because the only way they can get it is literally by not eating. So, I just think, why do you want to be on a zero carbohydrate diet when everything's stable? If your blood glucose is stable, and you're generally healthy. The other point is that when people are in ketosis for long enough, the ketosis will sometimes, in many occasions, it will bump up cortisol. And the bumping up of cortisol will bump up glucocorticoid, and then you see increases in blood glucose. So many people who are in ketosis for too long will actually see the reverse effect, and blood glucose starts going up. And I have an age group athlete, and we know when his carbohydrate levels are too low, because his blood glucose goes up, which is contrary to what we would believe, right? But then we find, okay, you need to add in some carbohydrates before bed. His blood glucose levels will come back down to between 4 and 5. But if he gets too low for too long on the carbohydrates, which he's guilty of a lot, then we see his blood glucose going up. And I think, again, if you're searching for optimal health and well-being, then it's probably not the best.
Right. Yeah, you're in the same boat as the 30% in that study, but with a reverse dietary pattern. What about during the event itself? Is there, because that's another pushback option. I'll be like, I remember someone was like, well, why are you taking in 40 grams or 50 grams of carbohydrate during the event itself? If your fat oxidation rates are high, shouldn't you be able to manage the glucose side of the equation through gluconeogenesis? And my response is always like, it's just not going to be quick enough.
Yeah, I don't think you won't be able to manage it quick enough on the glucose. I haven't really looked into it because I think it's almost one of those things that I wouldn't look into because it seems so obvious that it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of a silly, I mean, like, I don't want to be offensive, but it seems like a silly question to me, because like when you just look at everything we've talked about and just like the sheer energy demand that you're asking yourself to put out, like there's you would think, and when you're doing an event where you're metabolizing so much energy, it would be the equivalent of going essentially days without eating. It's like you're just not going to perform as well after 3 days of no consumption as you are going to in like a relatively fed state, regardless of the macronutrient you're taking in.
And that's the thing. It's all about performance. But at that stage of the game, it's all about performance, right? And I think like I'm gonna hedge my bets and say that I'm gonna get a more safer and consistent performance by putting in a small amount of carbohydrates. I think you're just it's a bit of Russian roulette when you're just trying to just go off pure fats alone, So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Dan, this has been a fun chat. I'm always interested to hear your take on this stuff. And again, I think we actually talked about this offline, but congratulations on your most recent half Ironman win.
Thank you. Yeah. So now I've got Challenge Roth in end of June. So
awesome.
Yeah, a big challenge Ironman. So yeah, full steam ahead for that.
Very cool.
Did a big 30K run this morning, Zach. You would have been proud.
Yeah, heck yeah.
A big hilly 30K run.
That's awesome. Yeah. That is awesome. Yeah. No, good to hear it. Yeah, well, thanks again. And I know you're over in New Zealand, so it's Friday morning for you, Thursday night for me. So I'll let you get going with your day.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Zach. Ciao, ciao.
Right. Yeah, take care, Dan. Have a good one. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this episode's sponsors are my friends at LMNT Electrolytes. They have a wide range of electrolyte supplements and are currently offering listeners of this podcast a free sample pack with purchase. If you are interested in checking them out and letting them know that you came to them through here, you can go to drinklmnt.com/HPO or to the show sponsor landing page, which is just zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Links to that are in the show notes as well. Hey folks, thanks for checking out this episode of the podcast. For those of you who are regular listeners, you'll likely know I'm also a professional endurance athlete and coach. If you're looking for a little extra help with your training and programming, I do offer individualized coaching options where you can work directly with me one-on-one. I'll personalize your plan and even scale it up to email collaboration and regular consultations. You can also access either of those on their own if you just want to contact me as you're navigating your fitness journey. I also have some ready-made plans. The ready-made plans follow my coaching philosophy, and they scale from 5 kilometers all the way up to 100 miles and come in 3 different levels. So whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, I've got something for you there. And most recently, I also just added a strength athlete's guide to endurance program, which will help someone who is primarily a strength athlete who wants to either do an endurance event for the fun of it, bolster up their cardiovascular fitness, or just try something out, try something new. So those programs are built to be able to supplement a strength program so you won't have to give up on your gains in the gym while you're going after some running or endurance related fitness goals. You can find all those things on my website at zachbitter.com. Thanks for checking out this episode. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.